He was invisible to most people, just a janitor, sweeping floors in a building that wasn't his. No one cared to learn his name. No one listened when he spoke. But one night, while the world looked away, he noticed something no one else did, something hidden in plain sight, something that could mean life or death. And the way people ignored him, dismissed him, almost cost a man his future. How could the one society looked down on end up holding the power to save the life of the man at the very top? It began quietly, like most stories of overlooked lives do. His name was David Johnson, a man who carried himself with quiet dignity, even as the world treated him as if he were less than human. At 52 years old, David had spent decades working in silence, pushing mop buckets and polishing floors in the glittering headquarters of a company he could never dream of owning. By day, the halls shone with ambition and luxury. By night, David made sure they were spotless, invisible evidence of his labor erased before dawn. To most employees, he wasn't even David. He was just a janitor, a shadow in the corner, someone who blended into the background. Few bothered to thank him. Even fewer noticed when he worked for back pain or exhaustion. Racism had taught him his place in their eyes, silent, unseen, unimportant. But what they didn't know was that David saw everything. The office might not have been his by title, but his eyes missed nothing. He knew who stayed late, who cut corners, who whispered in the break rooms, who hid behind glass doors. And more importantly, he noticed things others overlooked, not out of choice, but out of survival. When you're invisible, you learn to watch carefully. On the surface, David's life was simple. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the edge of town, walls decorated with old photographs of his late wife and the children who now lived miles away. He rode the same bus each night, carried the same brown lunch bag, wore the same faded uniform. To strangers, his days were ordinary, almost forgettable. But inside, he carried a weight, decades of quiet slights, of being underestimated, of working twice as hard for half the recognition. That week at the company, whispers filled the air. The CEO, Richard Coleman, a man of wealth and untouchable status, had returned from a business trip overseas. The building buzzed with energy whenever he was around. Executives straightened their ties, assistants rushed through halls, security tightened every door. David watched from the background, mop in hand, unseen by the men and women who walked past him. To them, Richard was a giant. To David, he was just another man. But that night, when Richard stayed late in his top floor office, something happened, something no one else saw. First, it was subtle. A tremor in Richard's hand as he signed papers. A pale tint to his skin as he leaned back in his chair. The kind of detail only someone like David, always watching, always unnoticed, would catch. David paused, his sweeping, his eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. The CEO's movements were slow, his face pinched in discomfort. He reached for a glass of water, but his grip faltered, spilling droplets across expensive wood. David hesitated. He wasn't supposed to speak up. People like him, black men in janitor uniforms, were expected to stay silent, to keep working no matter what they saw. If he walked into that office, if he dared to interrupt, he knew exactly how it would look. A black janitor intruding where he didn't belong, but he also knew what he was seeing. He had watched his own father suffer before a heart attack. The small warning signs missed until it was too late. And here they were again, symptoms in front of his eyes, ignored by everyone else. Still, the doubt lingered. Would anyone believe him? Or would they brush him off, laugh behind his back, maybe even punish him for stepping out of line? The night stretched tense and heavy. David moved closer, carefully, as if crossing an invisible barrier that separated his world from theirs. He whispered politely, almost apologetically, "Sir, are you feeling all right?" The CEO barely lifted his head. His lips parted, but his voice faltered, words slurred. That was all the confirmation David needed. Something was very wrong. Heart pounding, David rushed toward the door, searching for help. But the halls were empty. The executives had gone home hours ago. The security guards at the front desk barely looked up when David tried to get their attention. "Sir, the CEO. He needs help. Now." They glanced at him with skepticism. One of them scoffed. What are you talking about? You're just a janitor, probably overreacting. David's chest tightened. There it was again, that wall of disbelief built not on facts, but on who he was. Black, working class, invisible. His word meant nothing against the marble floors and glass walls of this empire. Meanwhile, upstairs, Richard was alone, his body weakening, his breaths uneven. David knew he didn't have time to argue. The guards weren't going to listen. Nobody was. And every second wasted could mean the difference between life and death. So he made a choice. He sprinted back up the stairs, his old knees aching, determination fueling each step. When he reached Richard's office, he found the CEO slumped in his chair, sweat trickling down his temples. The sight was jarring. The untouchable leader of $1 million company, fragile and human, his life slipping silently away. David's mind raced. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't trained for this. But he knew enough to act. He pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services, his voice urgent as he described the symptoms. The dispatcher promised help was on the way, but the minutes dragged like hours. David stayed by Richard's side, steadying him, whispering words of reassurance the man could barely hear. And yet, behind every second, fear gnawed at David's chest. Not just fear of losing Richard, but fear of what might come after. If Richard survived, would anyone acknowledge what David had done? Or would they erase his role entirely, pretending he had never been there? And if he didn't survive, would they blame David for being the only one in the room? Downstairs, sirens finally wailed in the distance. But before help arrived, Richard's body convulsed, his breath catching in a terrifying gasp. David's hands trembled as he reached for him, caught between panic and resolve. In that moment, he was no longer invisible. He was the only thing standing between life and death. And yet, nobody had any idea. The sound of Richard's ragged breathing filled the office. His skin was pale, his lips faintly blue. David's heart pounded so loudly he could feel it in his throat. He knelt beside the CEO, gripping his phone with one hand while steadying Richard with the other. "Stay with me, sir. Help is coming," David urged, his voice trembling. But Richard's eyes rolled back. His chest jerked in shallow, uneven spasms. Then stillness. David froze. Fear stabbed through him like ice. He had seen this before: his own father, collapsing in their small living room. The silence that followed before anyone realized he was gone. That memory crashed into him with unbearable force. Not again. Not tonight. He dropped his phone and pressed two fingers against Richard's neck. No pulse. Time seemed to stop. For a moment, David's hands hovered, shaking. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't supposed to be here. If anyone walked in, what would they see? A black janitor standing over a collapsed CEO, his hands on his body. He could already hear the accusations in his head. What did you do to him? But then something deeper rose inside him, the part of him that refused to stand by while another man's life slipped away. He couldn't let fear, or racism, or the world's judgment stop him now. He placed his hands firmly on Richard's chest and began compressions. 1, 2, 3. He counted under his breath, pushing past his own exhaustion, forcing rhythm into Richard's still body. The silence of the office was broken only by the sound of David's labored breaths and the desperate thump of his palms. "Come on," he muttered. "Don't you leave now. Not like this." Minutes stretched like eternity. Sweat rolled down his temples. Every push was a battle against despair. And yet he kept going. He had to. Then faintly Richard gasped. His chest rose, uneven but alive. David froze, his arms trembling with relief. A weak pulse fluttered beneath his fingers. Richard was still here. Barely, but here. At that exact moment, the doors burst open. Paramedics stormed in, their equipment clattering against the polished floor. They barely glanced at David as they rushed to Richard's side, voices sharp and commanding. David stumbled back, his chest heaving. His knees ached. His shirt clung to his skin. He had saved him. He knew he had, but no one asked. One of the paramedics turned briefly toward him. "Who found him?" David started, his voice hoarse. The men barely listened. "Okay, we'll take it from here." And just like that, David was invisible again, He stepped back into the shadows as they lifted Richard onto a stretcher, attaching wires and masks, shouting numbers he didn't understand. The office, once suffocating in silence, now buzzed with urgency. But David felt small, erased, as though his role in the moment had already been forgotten. By the time they wheeled Richard out, security had crowded the hall. The same guards who hadn't believed him now stood alert, pretending they had everything under control. Their eyes landed on David, suspicious, scrutinizing. "You were in his office?" one asked coldly. David swallowed hard. "Yes." He collapsed. "I called 911. A pause. The guard's eyes narrowed. "And what were you doing in there?" David's chest tightened. He wanted to scream. "I saved his life." He wanted to shout the truth until the walls cracked. But he saw it in their faces already, the doubt, the suspicion. To them, he wasn't a hero. He was just a janitor. Just another black man out of place. That night, David walked home in silence. The city lights blurred past him, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind replaying every second. Richard was alive, that was what mattered. But deep down, a gnawing truth burned in him. No one would ever know. And he was right. The next morning, headlines spread. CEO hospitalized after medical emergency. The articles praised the swift response of paramedics, the efficiency of corporate staff who ensured immediate care. Not one word about the janitor who had been there first. Not one mention of the hands that had kept Richard alive until help arrived. David read the news alone in his apartment, bitterness curdling in his chest. He wasn't surprised, but he was angry. Angry at how easily his part had been erased, how the world chose once again to silence his existence. But then, something unexpected happened. 3 days later, Richard woke up, and he remembered. The company held a press conference to update the public. Cameras flashed, reporters buzzed, executives lined the stage. Richard, pale but alive, leaned into the microphone. He spoke of the scare, of his gratitude for the medical team, of the fragility of life, and then he paused. "There's one more thing I need to say," he began, his voice steady despite the murmurs in the crowd. "When I collapsed, there was one man in the room. One man who noticed something was wrong before anyone else. One man who refused to give up on me. His name is David Johnson. He's not a doctor. He's not an executive. He's our janitor. And without him, I would not be standing here today." The room went silent. Cameras clicked wildly. Executives exchanged shocked glances. For the first time in decades, David's name was spoken with respect, but as applause rippled through the audience, David didn't smile. He stood in the back, his face unreadable. Yes, Richard had acknowledged him. Yes, the truth was finally spoken. But David knew it wasn't just about him, because for every story like his, there were countless others erased. Countless black men and women whose contributions were ignored, whose warnings were dismissed, whose humanity was denied until it was too late. David went home that night with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that he had saved a life. Sorrow that it took nearly losing the CEO for anyone to recognize his worth. The truth was simple. His invisibility hadn't vanished. It had just been revealed, for one brief moment, under a spotlight. Tomorrow, the world would forget again, but maybe, just maybe, someone watching wouldn't. Maybe a young man overlooked in his own life would hear David's story and realize he wasn't alone. Maybe someone in power would think twice before dismissing the voice of someone who didn't look like them. Maybe a single life saved could ripple outward, forcing people to see what they'd ignored for so long. David couldn't change the system overnight. But his story, his courage in the face of invisibility, was proof of something bigger. That racism doesn't just kill through violence. Sometimes it kills through silence, through disbelief, through the refusal to see. He had been invisible his whole life. But on that night, when it mattered most, he had refused to be, and that choice had saved a life. The question now was this: how many more lives must be lost, overlooked, or silenced before the world finally learns to see?